time to master pet. I'ma tell the whole truth and shame the devil.
Shalom fam, thank you once again for tuning in here at Word Made Fresh. I am Solomon, that's Shaloma, and we are pretty deep into our series Torah or Nah. This is video number 6, so if you're new here, definitely want to encourage you to go back and check out the first 5 so you know where we stand and why we stand where we stand when it comes to this matter of what role does the law Torah play in the life of a believer today. We got some groundwork delay because we're looking at Shaul or Paul's writings. And if you understand anything about Paul's writings, he was given mysteries, you know. And so sometimes when you look at his writings, it's more than just what's on the surface. You got to dig a little deep. Paul has been accused of being in a sect, cult. You know, he's been accused of being a false apostle. Back then, and still the same today. He's been accused of disagreeing with Yahusha, disagreeing with the other apostles. And so we got to look at Paul's writings intensely because what we know is that scripture doesn't contradict itself. We know that. And so anytime we find anything about Paul's writings contradicting themselves, then we have to dig a little bit deeper. Peter puts it this way. Look at 2 Peter 3:16 and 17. He says, as also in all his letters, speaking in them concerning these matters, in which some are hard to understand, which those who are untaught and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do also the other scriptures. You then, beloved ones, being forewarned, watch lest you also fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the delusion of the lawless. So Peter says, listen, they are scriptures, they're just hard to understand. And he says, if you twist them around because you don't learn, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to fall away from what you stood firm on. And the reason you're going to fall away is because you're being led away by the delusion or the thought process, the ways of those that are lawless, those that are without law. And so anytime you twist Paul's scripture around, that's what you're going to end up with, lawlessness, right? Secondly, look at Paul's own admission in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 6. He says, but even if I am unskilled in word, yet not in knowledge, but in every way we have been manifested among you in all matters. But, you know, Paul's own admission is, I'm not the greatest with words. He said in another place, you know, I didn't come to you with excellency of speech. And so I say all that to say that when we look at Shaul Paul's writings, we got to understand the way our scriptures are broken down into chapters and subdivisions. Paul just wrote letters, you know, and sometimes you got to read, you know, several chapters within the letter to get what he's talking about. And he's just talking about one specific topic. Sometimes you got to read the entire letter as well. And so, again, when we look at Paul's writings, we got to be more diligent in our study of his writings. So let's do that. Let's go down to Romans chapter number 7, verse 1. Let's start there. And he says, or do you not know, brothers, for I speak to those knowing the Torah, that the Torah rules over a man as long as he lives. Go down to verse number 25. It says, thanks to Elohim through Yahusha Messiah, our master. So then with the mind, I myself truly serve the Torah of Elohim, but with the flesh, the Torah of sin. So sandwiched between verse number 1 that says the Torah rules over a man as long as he lives. Verse number 25, Paul says, I serve Torah. Sandwiched between those two verses, we're not going to find anything that contradicts. We're going to find supporting statements of those two verses. And so let's do that and look at verse number 2. Paul's getting ready to lay out an example in verse number 2 and 3. Here's the example. He says, for the married woman has been bound by Torah to the living husband. But if the husband dies, she is released from the Torah concerning her husband. So then, while her husband lives, she shall be called an adulteress if she becomes another man's. But if her husband dies, she is free from that part of the Torah, so that she is not an adulteress, having become another man's. So the example that Paul lays out is a simple one. Man, woman are married. She just can't go off and marry another man while her husband lives. If she does, then Torah is what's going to deem her an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's released from the Torah, but not the entirety of the Torah, just the part concerning marriage. She's released from that. So now she can marry another without being an adulteress. That's the example that Paul is giving. And so now he's getting ready to take that example, that physical example, and apply it in a spiritual sense in verse number 4 and following. So let's read verse number 4. The word says this, so my brothers, you also were put to death to the Torah through the body of Messiah, for you to become another's, the one who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to Elohim. I'm going to stop there in verse number 4, because we got a couple of questions we got to answer. He starts off by saying, he says, you also, meaning that what I just said in verse number 2 or 3, I'm applying that to you directly, right? It's a parallel comparison or analogy here. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves, and then number 1, who died in verse number 4? Because again, he's making that comparison. So who died in verse number 4? And then secondly, When it says put to death to the Torah, we're going to look at that phrase, but is he talking about the entirety of Torah, or is he talking about just a part of the Torah? Because remember, he's making a comparison in verse number 2 and 3, and he's applying that in verse number 4. So is it entire or just a little bit, right? That verse number 4, there's interpretation out there that says that Torah is what we were married to, or who we were married to. And you don't find that language anywhere throughout the scriptures. It doesn't say that Torah died. Matter of fact, that has to be inserted in the scriptures. It says we were put to death, but we were put to death to Torah. So what does death to Torah mean? Well, it means the exact same thing in verse number 2 and 3. Released from Torah, free from Torah. Let's go back a chapter, because remember, we said Paul doesn't just start this in chapter number 7. He starts in chapter number 6, explaining this whole concept to them. So let's go back a chapter and look at chapter number 6, verse number 2. He says this: let it not be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? He says died to sin. Back to Romans 7, verse 5, there are other translations that say we died to Torah, or death to Torah is the same thing. And so again, it just means that, we were released, we were free. We use the terminology in even our language, such and such is dead to me. What does that mean? That means I got no dealings with them. I don't talk to them. I don't speak with them. I got nothing to do with them. Well, that's exactly what he's saying here. So it doesn't mean that Torah died, is the point that I'm making. It just means that we were released from Torah. We were free from Torah, right? So we didn't die. In this passage of scripture, verse number 4, Torah didn't die, right? And we know that we didn't die because we got to become another. So we got to be living to become another's. We know Messiah did die, but he wasn't the one that we were married to initially, because he's the other one that we're becoming, right? So we still got to answer the question, who died? And then we got to answer the question, was it all or just a part of Torah? So let's continue to read, because verse number 4 doesn't really disclose that. Go down to verse number 5. The word says this: for when we were in the flesh, the passions of sin through the Torah, we'll look at that phrase, were working in our members to bear fruit to death. Now, remember, we said Paul didn't just introduce this whole concept in chapter number 7. So let's go back a chapter in verse number 6 and look at chapter number 6. In verse number 6, he says this. He says, knowing this, that our old man was impaled with him, so that the body of sin might be rendered powerless to serve sin no longer. So Romans 6:6, Romans 7:5 help us to understand who died in Romans 7:4, right? And if you look back in Romans 7:4, the latter part of that verse says that the relationship with us in Mashiach, the end result of that is we're bearing fruit to Elohim. Opposition of what I just told you in verse number 4, something different is happening. And so he's looking at the different relationship in verse number 5. The old relationship in verse number 5, he said the result of that was we bore fruit to death. Well, who were we in a relationship with that bore fruit to death? Well, it tells us when we were in the flesh. Verse number 6 says that it was our old man that impaled. So the person that died, that released us from the Torah, or put us to death to the Torah, wasn't Messiah, wasn't us, wasn't Torah. It was our old man. It was our flesh. That's who we were married to in verse number 4, right? And so now we still got to answer the second question. Is he talking about all of Torah, or are you talking about just part of Torah? So let's continue to read. Let's go down to chapter 7, verse number 6. And the word says this in verse number 6. He says, but now we have been released from the Torah, once again, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of letter. So he says we have been released from the Torah once again, right? What he's getting ready to expound upon is how Torah binds us. What am I talking about? Well, if you recall back in verse number 1 of chapter number 7, he said he was talking to those who know Torah, and that's so important. Well, what we know about Torah, for those who know Torah, is that Torah is more than just a bunch of do's and don'ts. Matter of fact, we looked at in the previous video, the purpose of Torah. I believe it was the first video. The purpose of Torah was established. And the purpose of Torah, which we won't look at all those scriptures, but Galatians 3:19 tells us, Romans and other passages tells us, but one of the purposes was the knowledge of sin. Torah tells us what our sin is, right? But the second purpose of Torah, according to the scriptures, we can find in Romans chapter 5, verse number 13, and it reads this: for until the Torah, sin was in the world, but sin is not reckoned when there is no Torah. So the second purpose of the Torah is to help us understand we're accountable for our sin. It puts sin on our account. That's what the word says. And so the question now, remember, if you go back to verse number 2 and 3, what Paul was emphasizing the whole time is the woman is bound by Torah. Well, when he gets to the example in verse 4, 5, and 6, he's still stressing the same thing about being bound by Torah. So he's not talking about the keeping of Torah. He's talking about the binding of Torah. Remember, the idea he's painting is marriage. She's bound by Torah in this marriage. Verse number 4, 5, and 6 is talking about a marriage. In the following verses, he's talking about a marriage. And he's saying in this marriage, there's some conflict. Me and my old man are at battle all the time. My mind wants to do this, but my flesh or my old man wants to do the opposite. And so when I want to do this, my flesh says no, and I do this. And what happens is this a constant conflict, fighting in his marriage. And he gets to the end of chapter number 7. He simply says, who's going to deliver me from this? He calls it the body of death. He's like, this marriage is going to kill me, but I can't get out of it. Why? Because I'm binded or bound by Torah. So the question is, how or why does Torah bind us, in this marriage to our old man? Well, once again, when we understand the purpose of Torah, we understand that Torah is the only thing that makes a man accountable for his sin. That's why the word says that before Torah, sin was in the world, but it wasn't reckoned. And so because Torah makes me accountable for my sin, then I'm married to this old man. I'm accountable for the sin that I commit in that flesh, or the sin that I commit in my old man. That's how Torah binds me to my flesh. It makes me accountable for the sin that I do in the flesh. That's what Paul is emphasizing this entire time. That's why he uses words like released from Torah. Why? Because I was bound. Free from Torah. Why? Because I was bound. He says again in verse number 6, released from Torah. He's simply stressing the binding functionality of Torah. He's not stressing the observance or the keeping of Torah when he's talking about being released or put to death. How do we know that? Well, because we know what Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 31. Let's go back a little bit. In Romans 3:31, he says this, do we then nullify the Torah through the belief? Let it not be. On the contrary, we establish Torah. Paul kept Torah. Paul believed in keeping Torah. There are other places in scripture where Paul said, and I'm not going to read it, but he said, listen, I got to go keep this feast by all means necessary. I got to keep this feast. Why? Because Paul believed in keeping Torah. So Paul's not contradicting himself here. He's just talking about the binding of Torah. But then he says, now that I've been released from the binding of Torah because my old man died, sin died. Therefore, my old man who I was married to, because he was the leader in this marriage, I'm no longer under his dominion. I'm married to another, that other being Messiah. And because I'm married to Messiah, now the sins that were performed in the old flesh, I'm not accountable for those anymore. The ones I performed before I was married to Messiah. The Most High said in Yahusha chapter 31, verse 34, when we looked at that prophecy in the previous video, let's go back and look at it real quick here, and then we'll wrap up. But Yahusha chapter 31, verse 34 says this. He says, and no longer shall they teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares Yahweh. For I shall forgive their crookedness and remember their sin no more. The sins that were done in the flesh, we weren't held accountable for anymore. Why? Because the Torah that held us to our flesh, we died to that. So therefore, now we can serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of the letter, right? That's what Paul is talking about, the binding of Torah, not the keeping of Torah within this marital context. Hey, so we're going to cut it short right there, and we're just going to stop because you can go on and on about this thing here. Listen, if you found any value, learn anything new, any insightful, feel free to hit the like button, comment. If you disagree, respectfully do the same as well. And listen, if you're new here, we definitely encourage you to subscribe. Come back. We got more videos to go over. We got Colossians, we got Hebrews, got Ephesians, even Galatians. Definitely, we got to hit all those as well. And so, stay tuned for upcoming videos. Definitely appreciate you taking the time out once again to check us out. Keep striving, and until next time, learn the word, live the word, and share the word. Shalom.
I'm tired of waiting, time to master pet. I'ma tell the whole truth and shame the devil.